This is Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. President Trump's administration is urging the Senate to pass the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Yesterday, the White House said in a statement that the bill would deliver tax relief, generational wealth reform, and historic spending cuts. Meanwhile, Democrats are making the opposite case. They say this bill would increase the national debt to dangerously high levels, cut vital welfare programs like Medicaid and food stamps, and that the tax cuts proposed in it will mainly benefit the rich. The bill passed the House, and it's now in the hands of the U.S. Senate to work on. President Trump wants to see it passed by July 4th. Joining us today to discuss is Senator Peter Welch. He's a Democrat who represents Vermont. He was Vermont's representative to Congress from 2007 to 2023. And now in the Senate, he currently serves on multiple committees, including Agriculture, Judiciary, Rules and Administration, and Finance. He joins me today in Vermont Public's studio in Colchester. Senator Welch, it's good to see you.
Thank you.
Senator, let's start with the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. It's this massive policy bill, as you well know, that it's making its way through Congress. And we've heard many Democratic critiques of this bill, particularly around its historic reductions in Medicaid spending. So I'd like to start there. Do you expect the Senate version of this bill to differ significantly from the House's in terms of Medicaid cuts?
Well, my hope is that we kill the bill. I mean, there'll be some adjustments that some of my Republican colleagues try to make to mitigate the damage, but this bill is very damaging to individuals in Vermont, very harmful for individuals here, and I'll go into that. But it's also really bad for the economy, and I'll start there. First of all, Vermonters don't believe they're going to get a tax cut out of this deal. You know, the tariffs are increasing cost for them, making it very, very tough for business, so inflation is going to be going up. Second, people just don't see that these tax cuts, if they're getting an everyday wage, drawn a salary, is going to be in any way meaningful. What people do see is that interest rates are going up, and that's because of the massive increase in the debt. And what are we getting for this? It's not as though we're borrowing money to rescue ourselves from the financial crisis of 2008 or get out of COVID. It's a huge addition to the debt, where interest rates are going up, so your credit card costs will go up. If you're trying to get a mortgage and they're already high rates, will be higher. So that, from a macroeconomic perspective, is terrible. From an actual impact on Vermonters, we've got like thousands of people who get their health care through Medicaid, and that includes disabled kids. And the parents are taking care of those kids, and Medicaid's a lifeline. They can lose that health care. The 2 out of 3 seniors who are in nursing homes, that is paid for by Medicaid, and they can be kicked out of those homes with these cuts. So it's very, very damaging there. Also, Vermont has strongly supported nutrition programs, farm to school, Meals on Wheels, school lunch, also the SNAP program. It's about $6 a day for families that are eligible. It really makes a difference. There's going to be billions of dollars cut from both Medicaid and the SNAP program, Meals on Wheels. And why in the world are we going to do that when the benefit is essentially going to be higher debt and some significant tax cuts to very, very wealthy people who don't need them and aren't asking for them, in corporations that are already paying record low tax rates.
So there are some tax cuts that it seems like would benefit people who are in lower income brackets, such as like no tax on tips and overtime pay. Would you support any of those provisions if they weren't also part of this massive legislation that also includes things like cuts for health insurance and food assistance?
Well, see, I would absolutely support lowering the tax rates for working class Vermonters. Whether you work in a warehouse or you work in a restaurant, I think you should have lower taxes compared to the Elon Musk of the world. I would definitely favor that. But the vast majority of this goes towards the very wealthy and the corporations. So it is not going to be, in my view, very strongly in my view, it's not going to be beneficial to Vermonters. And by the way, when you have these cuts, like to Medicaid or the Affordable Care Act, where people get some help paying the premiums if they're in the gig economy. What happens then is that those folks still get sick. They go to the community hospitals. They're operating on a thin margin right now. So they're going to be, those hospitals who are in jeopardy now financially are going to be very, very harmed by this because they won't get to pay. They won't get reimbursed for that coverage. So, and then ultimately what happens is that those folks who are on employer-sponsored health care, those premiums go up and the cost shift that we all know about intensifies. So from a public health standpoint, this legislation is a very significant threat to the well-being of the healthcare system we have here in Vermont.
Okay, so help me understand something here, Senator. I was reading an article this morning from Politico, and they reported that in the 2024 election, nearly half of Medicaid recipients, 49%, voted for President Trump, and that's compared to 47% for Kamala Harris. So basically, a lot of people who get Medicaid are Trump supporters. So what's going on here? Has there been a failure of communication about the stakes of these Medicaid cuts, or is Medicaid potentially less important to Republican voters than Democrats are betting on?
Well, I'd say two things. First of all, on the question of what's in this bill, the polling shows that when people are aware of it, and it's like a third of the people are aware of it, like 75% are against it, including well over a majority of Republicans. People want their health care. And by the way, Trump claims that there's no Medicaid cuts in the bill, which is a total lie. So people like their Medicaid. And the public awareness is really important so that more people are aware that this is a legislation that is going to have a huge impact.
Yes, he's made statements saying that Republicans in the Senate should protect Medicaid.
He said that,
Yeah.
and it's not true. This bill takes $700 billion out of the Medicaid program. So he said, we've seen this with President Trump. He says it, but it's not true. But the second thing is a very interesting question. How is it that folks who will lose Medicaid voted for Trump? And this is where I think Democrats have to ask themselves that question, because what Trump did do is speak to the discontent that a lot of people have that the system or the economy is not working for them. And in fact, I'm in agreement with that. If you're going paycheck to paycheck, if you have a car breakdown, if you have a kid who needs braces, you're not going to be able to pay your bills. So there's a lot of economic anxiety in a sense that we do need some significant change. And Trump, I think, very effectively tapped into that. His remedies are catastrophic for the well-being of working-class Vermonters and Americans. These tariffs are going to increase, and already are increasing our costs. You know, somebody who wants to get a Nintendo Switch 2, $100 additional costs because of the tariffs. So, and then if we start losing Medicaid, you're not going to have your own individual health care, but it threatens our hospitals. So a lot of these proposals that he makes are going to hurt, not help, even though I think on an emotional level, he was very effective at tapping into people's sense that, hey, we've got to change things.
You brought up Elon Musk a minute ago. I want to ask you about him because we've seen this rift between the close ties he's had with President Trump just in recent weeks. And he's also been speaking out about how this big, beautiful bill could affect the national debt. Elon Musk says the level of debt would be unsustainable. So now many Democrats find themselves agreeing with a person who for months they've been saying should not be as close to the president as he is and who is doing harmful things to the federal government. What do you make of this change?
I mean, there's two things. One, Musk is just this larger-than-life figure. I mean, $400 billion, throws his weight around. He comes in and is a so-called special assistant, and he then rampages through government with his Doge, cutting things where he sends out emails to individuals who've been working for 20 years telling them that they haven't been doing a good job and they're gone. And he demolishes USAID. We literally have food that is in a warehouse with children on the outside of the doors, and that food is rotting. Medicine, the same way. So I have real problems with him and his approach and his bullying. But on the other hand, there's certain positions he takes that I favor. He's for electric vehicles. That's a really good thing. We should be maintaining support for the transition to a clean energy economy. And his criticism of this bill on the basis of it adding to the debt is absolutely correct. And what's so harmful about that debt is we're not getting anything for it other than funding significant tax cuts. Like if you're one of these multimillionaires, you're going to get $450,000. So I'm with him on that. And I also see this debt issue as something that we do have to address it, because a country does have to borrow at times if there's an emergency, if there's a war. But where you're borrowing just to finance a tax cut, that's wrong.
Recently, my colleague Bob Kinzel sat down with your predecessor in the Senate, Senator Patrick Leahy, who retired about 2.5 years ago, and they discussed the budget bill. And Senator Leahy, I was struck when I was listening to the tape, he had some really strong words about members of the House and Senate who are not opposing President Trump. Let's take a listen.
And I am worried that the Senate, which can be and should be the conscience of the nation. Remember, there's only 100 senators, 100, to represent over 300 million Americans. They have a responsibility to more than just their own careers. They have a responsibility to the country. And they've got to stand up and say, you can't ignore the law like this. You can't just do away with departments that are congressionally mandated. Not presidentially mandated, but congressionally. If you're not willing to stand up, then get out of the Senate, get out of the House.
So, strong words. But, as a Democrat in the Senate, you and every single other Democrat can vote against this bill and it can still pass. So the goal here, it seems, is to try to convince a handful of Republicans. I think you need at least 3 or 4 to vote no.
That's correct.
How do you do that?
Well, first of all, I'm 100% in agreement with Senator Leahy. And it's important because what he's standing up for is the separation of powers, and that we have a government that is based on 3 competing branches, the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. And what he's talking about, and I fear, and unfortunately he's right, is Congress is abdicating its independent authority under Article 1 to the president. And let me give 2 examples. Only Congress can pass tariffs. That's in the Constitution. Trump is doing it. Now, he was set back in the courts, but he is assuming power from the Congress. And my Republican colleagues, regrettably, are not standing up for the constitutional responsibilities of Congress to do that. They're abdicating them to the president. Same way with budgeting. The Congress has the power. The person decides what the budget is. Trump is disregarding that, moving money around or taking money away, like from USAID. So the danger that we have is that you allow the accumulation of almost absolute power in the executive. And we all know that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that's where in the Congress that Patrick Leahy went to as a young man in 1974, Republicans and Democrats would never have allowed a president like Nixon to impound money and interfere with the congressional authority. So that's what he's talking about, and I agree with him because it's very painful for me to see my colleagues essentially just accede to whatever it is the president wants. Now, on the political side, that's why a big part of my time is how can I persuade 3 or 4 of my Republican colleagues, for instance, to vote no on this bill.
We got a question about this from a listener named 10 who asks, what are you doing to block the reconciliation bill before the Senate? And another person asked, Carl in Essex asked, how do you choose your wording when you are pushing back against Trump's repressive policies? Do you consider that choices that resonate in very blue Vermont could end up hurting their chances in more purple states?
Well, the comprehensive way I've approached trying to deal with this budget disaster in this bill is by getting the information out. And the same thing with tariffs, which I think are having a detrimental impact on Vermont businesses, Vermont farmers, and Vermont consumers. So a lot of what I'll do is have roundtables where we will have people who are going to be affected by the tariffs or be affected by these Medicare cuts, Medicaid cuts, to be able to talk about that and get that information out. And what I do with my Republican colleagues is I don't give them a lecture, but I'll find out about the community hospital situation in their district or their state. And I'll ask them, what's going to happen if this bill passes to your community hospitals? And then the reality is the answer is that those hospitals in their districts are going to be really hurt. So what I'm trying to do is encourage them to have more deference to the needs of the people they represent than they do to the will of President Trump. And those folks are under an immense amount of pressure on the Republican side to basically do whatever Trump wants. And that's painful to see because that what Trump wants to do, particularly in this bill, is going to hurt the people they represent. This legislation, the so-called Big Beautiful Bill, that is going to inflict bipartisan suffering. It doesn't matter whether you're in a red state or a blue state. You lose your health care, you lose your community hospital, you start paying higher tariffs. You see your colleges that are dependent on some of these grants and it's integrated and that's getting taken away. That's going to hurt all of us.
Senator, we got an email just now from Will in Craftsbury, who writes that he works at a business in the Northeast Kingdom. And he says, quote, with the enacting of tariffs by Canada on their citizens in response to President Trump's tariffs, we have seen a total drying up of tourists visiting our business in the NEK. Now, a few weeks ago in late May, you traveled to Ottawa with a bipartisan delegation of 4 Democratic senators and 1 Republican. You met with the newly elected Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and other senior officials there in Canada. What was the tenor of that conversation? What were your takeaways?
Well, before I get to that, let me just acknowledge what he said.
Yeah.
Tourism is drying up. It has had an enormously negative impact on tourism here in Vermont. I was with Senator Shaheen. It's really affected New Hampshire as well. Kevin Kramer from the Republican from North Dakota is really affected the tourism there. And it's all a self-inflicted wound. Our visit with the Prime Minister, first of all, it's the first time in 5 years that a Senate delegation visited with the Canadian Premier. And that, I think, is terrible because we have such a close relationship. We've got to spend more time nurturing it. Second, Canada expressed to us, as we expressed to the Prime Minister, our desire to maintain the historically strong both economic and emotional ties that we've had with one another. But there was a lot of candor on the part of the Prime Minister and the Canadian ministers we met with. Canada is really upset with the talk about the 51st state and about the governor of Canada. They felt that their really good friend, the United States, was insulting them, obviously the words of President Trump. So it has made them think that they have to take steps to have some independence so that they're not totally dependent on the U.S. On the other hand, they clearly, and the Prime Minister stated this, and it was music to our ears, they want to restore the strong relationships we've had. And much of that will depend on whether this tariff regime that President Trump is pushing gets resolved. That's having enormously disruptive impacts on their economy. And they can't be subject to a situation where already, since tariffs began, President Trump has changed them 22 times. That's creating enormous disruption in Canada, and by the way, here as well. So they want to maintain the relationships with us. I think most of us in the Senate, all of us probably, want to maintain that special relationship we've had with Canada. And that means that if we're going to have trade negotiations, that they should be bipartisan or bilateral discussions rather than whimsical day-to-day changes that come out of the White House.
Why do you think there weren't more Republicans as part of this delegation? And there's so many states with Republican senators that border Canada.
Well, it's tough for my Republican colleagues because they get in the crosshairs of President Trump. And by the way, until recently, Elon Musk. Trump will take retaliatory action against anybody who he perceives as a foe, not just senators, but he will do that as well. So they fear an immense amount of electoral retaliation, including someone like Elon Musk, until recently, financing a primary against them. And, at a certain point, my colleagues on the Republican side have to make a decision as to whether what Trump wants to do is really hurting their people, the people they represent, like the folks who do need Medicaid, or the folks who have businesses where these tariffs are going to really hurt them. My hope is they'll come around and make a decision that's best for the people they represent, as opposed to just appeasing Trump.
Let's bring in some voices of Vermonters here. We have Tina calling in from Clarendon. Tina, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for taking my call. And Senator Welch, thank you for your work. My question is, we've heard a lot of specifics on what's going to be cut in this bill, the Medicaid and other things. What we have not heard is any specifics on tax cuts for the wealthy. I have no clue what you're talking about. I didn't when Trump was in for the first term, what those tax cuts entailed. I'd like to hear more specifics on the tax cuts so I know what the other side of the scale is. Thank you.
Well, in the multinational corporate tax cuts, that was a big one. In the last bill, the tax rate theoretically was 35%, and it went down to 21%. That was literally trillions of dollars. And by the way, when the corporations were advocating, these are the major multinational corporations, they were asking for a reduction to 25%. But Trump bid it up and got it down to 21. I mean, that was really bizarre. Trump gave them more than they were even asking for. And then on the very wealthy, we're talking about billionaires here. The effective tax rate went down a couple of points, but that adds up to real money.
Thank you, Tina, for calling in. Let's go next to Regis, who's in Montreal. Regis, you're on the air. Go ahead.
I have several properties in America: Florida, Vermont. I got a large sailboat in Plattsburgh, New York.
Good for you.
Crossed the border on Saturday. Yeah, well, I worked for it. I didn't inherit it.
I believe you.
I earned it. Okay. Now, the other thing is, I crossed the border, and it was like nobody on a Saturday. Crickets. I mean, I could hear crickets at the Lacoste border in Plattsburgh. It was dead quiet. I went out to dinner at the Texas Roadhouse again. I spoke to the waiter. He said we had to shut a shift because there's no more Canadians coming into town. So it's kind of sad because, I enjoy coming to America, and it's kind of sad coming here and, the Canadians are there. Hope things go back to normal. And another thing, I hope, go right ahead.
No, an earlier caller from the Northeast Kingdom was talking about how tourism has really collapsed, and it has, and it's really harmful for our economy. But it's emotionally painful because Vermonters who are in the hospitality industry, they really like the Canadians being here. And they've gotten to know many of the people who come every year at a certain time. So that's been a really unfortunate impact of the trade war, in effect. And my hope is, and that was the point of our trip up to Canada, is that we want to do all we can to get us back on track.
Regis, did you have one more question for the senator?
I hope there's like a law the governor of New York is trying to put through, because I spend a little too much time in America. I go past that 6 months stay, and I get pulled over into secondary because I overstay my stay. So this year I'm going to Paris for a month because I can't stay on my boat because I go to Florida in the winter, and then I get pulled over into secondary at the border in Vermont, and they go through my car like I'm a criminal, and, where are you going? Do you work here? No, I don't. I'm just,
Regis, if you need a ship hand on that trip to Paris, you just give me a call. Thank you so much for calling in.
You.
Let's bring in another caller here. We have John in Middlesex. John, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Hi, Senator Welch. I'm calling. I wonder how aware you are of the potential closure of the Copley Birthing Center in Morrisville. A couple of points, a question for you. Are you getting any calls about that? What are people saying from the Lamoille County about this closure? Can you speak to the economic possibilities and the essential service that local hospitals and birthing centers bring
Yes.
to Vermont, and what kind of weight might the delegation in Washington play to really deeply examining the reasons for the closure and finding ways to support essential services for mothers, children,
Okay.
and families in Lamoille County?
Thank you,
All right.
John.
Here's the answer on that. If we pass this big, beautiful bill with the Medicaid cuts, that jeopardizes all our community hospitals in Vermont, not just the birthing center, which is very, very popular and much needed at the hospital, because we take $700 billion out of Medicaid. That means that all those individuals who were dependent on Medicaid will still get sick, they'll still have babies, they'll go to our community hospitals, and the community hospitals won't be paid. So that economic pressure that our community hospitals are experiencing will intensify. We've got to kill this bill.
Is there anything else that can be done to support something like Copley's Birthing Center if indeed this bill passes?
This really is about Medicaid reimbursement. It's like you lose insurance.
Yeah.
Let's say you don't have insurance and you go to the hospital and they end up giving you care and they do it for free. Well, they can only do that so long. So what you're seeing in our healthcare system is that the cuts in terms of availability of insurance, Medicaid, to some extent, Medicare is threatened, by the way, with this bill, because if the debt goes up, that would trigger an automatic cut. The hospitals don't get reimbursed, and they have to make some very, very tough decisions. And what I'm saying to John is that the problems that we have with our financial well-being of our hospitals is enormously intensified if we take $700 billion out of Medicaid.
Thank you, John, for calling in. Colette is in Hardwick. Colette, go ahead.
Oh, hello. Hey, Senator, I just wanted to hit back on the issue of the Republicans and their inaction, and especially on this topic that we're talking about right now, having to do with resources for the lower income people. And I'm old enough to remember, I believe that it used to be the Republican argument in terms of meeting the needs of lower-income people, that it was the methods would be to support programs like the Earned Income Credit and the child tax credit, and even discussions about giving aid for Medicaid and that sort of thing. That was the correct response to helping the lower-income people. And now it seems like the Republicans have totally forgotten that, and that they're coming out against these programs and calling Democrats things like, they're the party of the welfare state. They're the party, we are, and I'm going to say I'm a hardcore, born and bred Democrat because of the issues of social justice and wanting things like health care for all. And that used to be a debate that happened among the Democrats, and the Republicans' response was, it's not that we don't care, it's that we just want to do it with these different programs, aid directly.
Colette, what I'm noticing, you're calling out this kind of shift in the messaging of the political parties when it comes to standing up for lower-income Americans.
Well, but what Colette said is also true. There's been a lot of Republican support for, like, the Earned Income Tax Credit.
Right.
There was a lot of support for the Child Tax Credit, and I'd like to see that continue. What you see is things are much different with Donald Trump, because he's saying, on the one hand, don't mess with Medicaid. On the other hand, he's promoting the big, beautiful bill that will take $700 billion out of Medicaid. So you've got this dedication that Trump has to talk like he wants to maintain that very important Medicaid program, when the bill he's demanding be passed cuts Medicaid by $700 billion. And it is to pay for tax cuts that do, by and large, go to very, very wealthy people. So that's an upside-down discussion. And, the reality is we should have a better tax system. Elon Musk, for instance, stops paying Social Security like in the first minute of the new economic year, whereas everyday Vermonters pay 7%, close to 7% on every dollar they earn throughout the entire year. We should have a tax system that gives some relief to hardworking, paycheck-to-paycheck folks. And we shouldn't be giving more tax cuts to very, very profitable corporations. And we should not certainly be giving tax cuts that are going to benefit the billionaires.
Well, thank you so much for calling in. I want to ask you about some recent news happened at the end of the week last week around broadband, which has long been an issue that you have been very outspoken on, getting more broadband access for Vermonters. Vermont is expecting to get more than $220 million for broadband build-out under this Biden-era program called BEAD. And on Friday, the feds just released new rules for this grant program. It's been under review for the past couple of months. Some states, including Vermont, have continued to advance this broadband expansion work during that review process. Do you know yet how these new rules will affect Vermont's broadband expansion work, or is that something your office is actively reviewing?
We are actively reviewing it, and I'm actively worried. Okay, we have to have broadband. You have to have high-speed internet in every part of Vermont in order for Vermonters to have the opportunity to be part of the economy. And we've made progress with the communication union districts that the legislature set up to give some local some local control and local ability to implement. It also takes money to wire it. So we've been making progress, but this BEAD money would be really essential to us being successful in the short term. And what we're seeing with the Trump administration is they've been clawing back money that was appropriated by Congress, sometimes for broadband, oftentimes for other infrastructure projects around the country, including clean energy projects that are going to would be really helpful to communities. And this goes back to a point that Senator Leahy was making. Congress shouldn't acquiesce to this because these appropriations were made by Congress. It's the constitutional authority of Congress to do that. And an executive doesn't have the unilateral authority to claw those back when Congress has appropriated that funding. And in Congress's past, even when I went there, the Republicans and Democrats wouldn't stand for a president of either party encroaching on the constitutional authority and responsibility of the legislative branch. We've got to stick up for the people.
One more question for you, Senator. Then I know you have a flight to catch to Washington to do some of this important work you're talking about. Last fall, Vermont's entire delegation sent a letter to FEMA calling for long-term structural reform. You also called for an audit of FEMA's administrative costs and this reduction of bureaucratic inefficiencies, which were called out in a big Vermont public investigation that came out late last summer. What is the status of that effort, and is it still a priority for you?
It's still a priority, and that is very much being contested. My view is that from our experience, the floods in 2023 and 2024, FEMA was really good in the immediate aftermath, but in the long-term recovery, it got bureaucratic, and my approach was that we had to give much more local control to the states and to the communities about the buildup and give them decision-making authority and access to the funds.
Sounds a bit like a Doge message there. Reducing inefficiencies at the federal level.
All of us are in favor of getting rid of inefficiencies, but what Doge did is they just destroyed things, all right? They didn't do a plan.
So that's not what you're saying. You're not saying let's get rid of FEMA.
No, I'm saying let's have local control on the follow-through. Mm-hmm. And a lot of my Republican colleagues are totally in agreement with me on that. If you're talking about should you have an 18-inch culvert or a 9-inch culvert, I trust the select board, okay, to make that decision. On the other hand, what the Trump administration is talking about, and Kristi Noem is talking about, the head of Homeland Security, is abolishing FEMA. So what they're literally talking about is returning responsibility to the states to recover from these catastrophic storms that are getting more frequent and more violent. And no state has the capacity. After Irene in 2011, we had billions of dollars of damage. After the floods of 2023 in July and then July in 2024, a state, whether it's us with flooding, whether it's Texas with California with wildfires, or North Carolina with that hurricane, you need federal help. And our congressional delegation, has always supported funding for that emergency relief to others when their time comes. So we need that FEMA organization, but we also need, and that's why I'm pushing hard for FEMA reform to make it more efficient.
Senator Welch, you're going to have to take our caller Regis's boat to get to Washington if I don't let you get to the airport. Senator, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much.